Hey everybody, and welcome back to Ready... Oh, I forgot the lights. Hey everybody, and welcome back to Ready Steady Play, where I am going to teach you how to play the Edge Dawnfall, which you know from the video title anyway. So, the Edge Dawnfall is a skirmish miniatures game. It's sort of a deathmatch skirmish battle, but there are multiple ways to win, and you don't always have to fight to the death, depending on how tough your squads are, and it's also got this really strong territory control, resource management, card play element to it. There's also like a deck building element, so there's an awful lot going on in the Edge Dawnfall, like a lot. But it's actually, it comes together in something that's not particularly complex, and although there's a lot of depth of choice, it's not actually that difficult to pick up and play, despite the intimidating size and box. So what I'll do is I'll explain what all these minis are, I'll explain how to get your faction up and going, I'll explain how to set up and play a skirmish game, and then you guys should be ready to hit the ground running. I'm not going to cover everything in this box in this one video because I'm not going to go into the darkness stretch goals or anything like that. I'm going to teach you how to play a competitive skirmish game, like a one-off if you're going to sit down to play with your friends. So I'll run you through the rules for that. And then if you like it and you want to see more, I will do videos for some more content later on down the line. But first, let's get you playing the game. So I'm going to run through how to play the skirmish game, and I'll talk quickly about the 6 factions as well. There's so much stuff in here that we don't even need for this particular video. This is a turn tracker. Don't need it. Sticker book. Don't need it. Art book. Don't need it. Campaign book. Don't need it. Rule book. Certainly don't need that. Faction sheets. Definitely need these. One for each faction. The actual game board, definitely need this. Now, if you're playing 3 to 4 players, you'll need both of these. But if you're just playing with 2 players, you'll only need one of them. Ugh. Chapter Demons campaign book, get out of here. Faceless versus Reborn campaign book, get out of here. Stretch goals, get out of here. Campaign trackers, get out of here. This is the short stories book. Don't need it. Comic book. Quick read. You could probably just breeze through this real quick. Or give it to people to read so they get in the mood. But don't need it. Oh. Now I have been playing, so I've sort of punched out all my punch board and stuff. As you can see here, we've got all the minis and all the factions and their inlays. Just loads of models. What we're going to need from here are these shields. We'll need those. Those are endurance tokens. We'll need these crystals. These are actually like the most important thing. I'll tell you about them later. These are totems and something else. I don't even know. We don't need these for the standard skirmish mode. They're additional rules I think we can add in later. Campaign tokens. We don't need these. I'll show you the tokens we do need. Dice. We'll definitely need dice. These tokens here. We'll need all of these. I'll show you what's in this bag in a minute. We're also going to need 2 factions. So for this video, I'll show you Chapter and Demons, because they're like the default 2 guys. But of course, you can pick any 2 you want. Just ask your friend, what do you think we should do? So far, I've managed to play with almost all of them. I reckon that the Chapter are probably the most straightforward. And so far, the most complex I've encountered are the Reborn. But I haven't actually had a chance to really get to grips with all of them in depth, so that might change later. So let's get our Chapter guys out here. We'll need the entire tray, and what we're going to need is all of the minis, the faction card, which is here, and a little bag of faction tokens here as well. I'll show you what I've got in here in just a minute. And I almost forgot, we're going to need some decks of cards. Ooh. Demons and Chapter. And the demons come out too. So I will explain the differences between the 3 and 4 player game as I go through this rules explanation, but I will be setting up a 2-player game. Oh, all the rest of this stuff goes back in the box. Oh, bye. So, as promised, here's one of the bags I've got here. Woo! All of these token types will be used in any game, although you definitely won't need all of these. You'll need this little victory point marker. You'll need these crystal sources. All 4 of those are essential. These are passive tokens to show when passive abilities have been activated. That'll make more sense later. Why would a passive ability be activated, you ask? Yes, it's a good question. These are not component limited, so you can just put out all of these. It's the same with these. These are to mark off when abilities have been used that can only be used within certain sort of time frames. For example, once per turn, or once per charge, or until a passive turn. All of this will make more sense when you understand how to play the game, but these are just to mark off when an ability has been used. Then we've got this, which is the first player marker, and we've got all of these little fiery tokens. These are charge tokens. Now, these are used to track charges on equipment that your squads have equipped. More on that later, but you'll need 20 of these in a 2-player game, and 30 and 40 for a 3 and 4-player game, and 40 in a team game. So count out the number you need and put the rest back in the bag because you just don't need them. These are component limited during setup, so it's important to have the right amount. Same with these crystals. These crystals are also component limited, so you'll need 20, 30, 40, so make sure you count out the right number of crystals. These are endurance tokens. These track your squad's hit points. Now, you'll need a number of these based on which squad you play, so you won't know how many you need until you've picked your teams and your units. But you'll probably need about 20, 25 of these. You're going to need some dice as well. Everybody gets 1 set of dice. You only actually ever need 2, 1 of each color, so that's enough for 2 players here. That covers the generic tokens. Those are all the tokens that are shared by the players. So now we'll have a quick look at the components you'll need for your faction. Here we've got the chapter. Each of these boxes, as far as I'm aware, has 6 squads, including your faction leader. So for the chapter, that's the Angel of Death. In addition to the Angel of Death, the chapter also features a unit of 4 pilgrims, a unit of 2 rangers, ignore this guy, he lost his head, and 3 holy knights who are each a unit individually. So here we've actually got 6 units. Then there's also the chapter elite unit, the Purge Doctors, who are a unit of 3 models. So you can tell who all these people are from these cards. Every faction comes with cards. And the cards are many different things. There's squad cards, action cards, a banner, and a turn card. And the action cards are many different kinds of cards. We'll have a look at more detail in the cards in a minute. I'm just going to show you the squad cards so you can see how they refer to the models, because then you can find the ones you need to play. So here, for example, we've got the Angel of Death. The Angel of Death is the faction leader. Now, she has 3 endurance points here. Remember those little shields we looked at earlier? That's denoting her endurance. I won't go through all the stats now. We'll look at those during gameplay. But the reason I mention the endurance is because there's a little set of symbols above it. Here, these white diamonds, and these indicate how many models are in the unit. So we know that there's 1 Angel of Death. But then here we've got the Holy Knight, and there's also 1 Holy Knight. So we've got a bunch of different Holy Knights, and the Rangers have 2 here. That means there's 2 in the squad. You can also see there's 2 models. And the Pilgrims, there's 4. And we've also got the Purge Doctors, and there's 3 of those. Note that these are the elite unit, and you can tell that these are the elite unit because it says so on the faction sheet. In addition to your squad cards, you should also have a passive and active turn card. This acts as a player aid to remind you what you can do on any given kind of turn. You can also flip it to indicate which kind of turn you took. You should have a chapter banner, and you should have a deck. This deck is your action cards, and you will draw these during the game, and they'll give you different things to do. In a 2-player game, you should have 25 cards, and in a 3 or 4-player game, you'll have 15. Here on the faction sheet, we can also see the faction tokens. Some factions don't have many tokens. The chapter only has 22 tokens, including their shrine. However, these 10 victory points are only used in the 3 or 4-player free-for-all and the team mode. You don't use these victory point tokens in the 2-player versus mode. I've conveniently sorted these tokens into bags, so that a player can just quickly grab the bag they want for the faction that they want. So did I say, look at all these models. Did I say 25 action cards? That's right, 25 action cards. You might have noticed that the game comes with a lot more than 25. In fact, it comes with probably around 75 or 80 for each faction. So that means there's a lot of options you have when you're building up this action card deck. And you can go in and edit it based on your particular playstyle, putting in more or less cards as you want. If you want to include your elite unit, it gives your opponent extra resources at the start of the game. I pointed out earlier, each faction sheet has a pre-constructed deck on it that it's recommended for your starting deck, and I totally recommend that you just build that and use it for your first few games until you get an idea about how the game works and how the factions play. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to need the chapter faction sheet and the demon faction sheet. All other faction sheets can go back in the box because you don't need them. But you definitely need this. Not only is it a handy guide to all of the cards and things available to you, but it has some rules clarifications on it. It's got a pre-constructed starter deck build that you can use. It tells you what your shrine does. It shows you all of the tokens for your faction as well. It also shows you a cheat sheet for all of your squads, and it gives you some flavor text and a tactical guide. So that's really good. Down here in the bottom corner as well, we've got some rules clarifications. You'll need to know about these for your faction, so make sure that you check that out on your faction sheet. The very first thing it actually says to do in the rules is set up the board, so why don't we do that? Now, if you're playing a two-player game, setting up the board is really easy. The board is also double-sided, and the sides' only difference is graphics, so you can play with either side of the board, whether you are two players or more. So there you have a board set up for two players. That's totally fine. One player will be here, and the other player will be here. And this is some kind of ruined churchy type place. On the other side, you've got like a hellscape. I guess this is the demon's origins. But you can also play on this side just the same as the other side. So if you're going to play with 3 to 4 players, you play with double boards like this. All right, there we go. That's the board set up for the 3 to 4 player game. Note that that's a 3 or 4 player free-for-all. This is also going to work for 2v2 team mode. I suppose you can play team mode 1v2 and one person just has 2 teams. There's no reason why you couldn't do that. Anyway, this is how you'd set the boards up. It works on the other demonic side as well, if that's your thing. All right, the next instruction we're given is give everybody dice. So everybody's going to need some dice. You only ever need 2 dice. A yellow one and a red one. That's it. That's all you need. Then we make a pile of neutral crystals and charges. And crystals are the resource in the game that you're going to use to pay for cards, to charge up dice. Everything is paid for with crystals. Crystals are incredibly important. Whatever the edge is, the planet somewhere, it just like runs on crystals. So these are the crystals here. And in a 2-player game, you'll put in 20 of them into the pool. In a 3-player free-for-all, it'll be 30. In a 4-player free-for-all, it'll be 40. In a team v team game, 2-on-2, it'll be 40. So get all the crystals that you need and put them in a pile. So as mentioned during component setup, you'll also need 20 of these charge tokens for a 2-player game, 30 and 40 for a 3 and 4 player free-for-all, and 40 for a 2v2 team game. And then you decide who's going to be first player and give them the little first player token here. Now, this is also going to have an impact on setup, with the player who's going to go first in the actual game becoming what's called the countering player during setup. And the player who goes second during the game will be the positioning player during setup. The positioning player has some advantage in sort of leading the designs of the battlefield, so to speak. You'll see how that works later. In a free-for-all, then it will just go clockwise from the first player around the table. In a 2v2 game, you should set it up so that it keeps alternating between teams for the 4 players. And once you've determined the first player, then you can choose factions. I mean, I've already got out the chapter and the demons, but, you can choose any 2 factions you want. Go crazy. It's very exciting. It's exciting stuff. And then you're instructed, the very first thing you're instructed to do once you've picked your faction is to plant your banner. This is your banner, and it goes here. The demons have one too. Boom, demon banner right there. Awesome. We've planted our banners. The next step is actually choose squads, and this is the first part of your army building. This is where you choose squads from your selection of squads available. So the chapter have, in addition to their elite unit, the Purge Doctors, another Holy Knight that they could swap in if they wanted to get rid of the Pilgrims or the Rangers, or you can even get rid of the Angel of Death, although I don't know why you would, but you could. You choose 5 squads, unless you're playing in a multiplayer game. That is, I mean, obviously a 2-player game is a multiplayer game, but if you're playing with 3 or 4 players, then you're going to choose 4 squads instead of 5. And so once you've picked your squads, you just lay out their cards along your side of the board like this. When you're setting out your cards, make sure you set them out on their basic mode side. We've got the stuff for the demons here. Now you'll notice that there are duplicates of some units, like for example the demons here have 2 gorehounds, and what we'll have to do is match up the pictures with the models. There you go, see how they're different? See how they're different? Do you know how you can tell the difference? This one has big spinies on his back, see? This one doesn't have any spinies. See? Or they're flat. Less spinies. So after you've laid out your squads, it instructs you to give them endurance. That's where you get these little wooden tokens, and just put a little endurance token down next to each squad for every little shield icon they have. So as you can see here, I've given the Dark Scholars 1 shield because they have 1 shield icon. The Gorehounds each have 1 shield as well. The Master of Elements has 3 endurance tokens, and the Son of Kyber has 4 endurance tokens. Good, now everybody's got their endurance tokens. The next thing we're instructed to do is construct our action decks. I've already got the starter pre-constructed recommended action decks set up here, but you can of course build your own. In fact, if you're playing with 3 or 4 players or in the competitive team mode, you'll have to build your own decks because you can only have 15 cards. And the pre-constructed decks contain 25. Also 5 squads, so you'll have to drop a squad as well. So you'll need to figure that out before you play. And make sure you spend some time building some fun decks that people actually enjoy playing with. It's worth noting that all of the combat cards have dual purposes. I'll go through in the gameplay section of this video how these cards work and what you can expect from them. But it's important to note that the majority of your action cards will have 2 triggering effects. One will be a general effect that can be used by any squad, and the other will be an effect that's particular to a squad in your army. So for example, this card I'm holding right here is a Pilgrim card. So we can see here that it's got charging at the top, which is a generic thing that charges enhancements. That's fine. It's also got a bottom effect. You have to pick one or the other to use, and that's a Pilgrim effect, so it refers to the unit of Pilgrims, which are these guys. So the reason I mention that now is because obviously you don't want to put all the Pilgrim cards in your deck if you've built an army without Pilgrims in them. So make sure you only include cards in your deck from the units or squads that are present in your army. And then when you're done building your deck, you can just put it down here. Also shuffle it. So now that we're at this stage of the game, the player with the first player token will choose whether to be the positioning player or the countering player. The countering player will play the first turn of the game, but the positioning player will lead on the board setup and deployment. The positioning player will also get a bonus move action at the end of this setup phase. So that gives them sort of a tactical advantage during setup that's then counterbalanced by the countering player having the first turn of the game. So whether you decide to be the positioning player or the countering player, give the first player marker to the countering player because they'll have the first turn of the game. If you're playing with 3 or 4 players, there can only be one countering player who'll play first in the game. So if you want to be a positioning player and you have the token, pass it to the next player in turn order, clockwise around the table, and they'll have the secondary choice. If it's a team game, you make the choice yourself, then pass it to one of the opposing team's players, and if they don't want it, they'll pass it back to your teammate, and so on, until you've decided who's going to be the countering player. And then we're going to move on to the first step of actual board setup here, which is place shrines. This is the place shrines step. And if you're playing a full skirmish game, you will now decide where to place your shrines. Different shrines do different things. Some give you buffs for touching them during a passive phase. What does that mean? Well, you'll learn more about that later. But basically being in base being next to them will power you up. Other shrines will hurt enemies who are touching it. One shrine, the Reborn Shrine, goes branches. It's basically a forest that spreads out across the board. The Razak, who are time travelers from the future who shoot lightning, their shrine is basically just a debuff cloud that floats around the battlefield, debuffing people it touches. However, what I'm going to show you now is the default setup for the first game. See, if we were going to play a full mode game, we would have to place these shrines. They can go literally anywhere, but whoever places the second shrine cannot place it within 2 spaces of the first shrine. And then we're going to play our crystal sources in exactly the same way. Going back to the positioning player plays the first shrine, the positioning player will place the first crystal source as well. And the countering player follows second. And in a 2-player versus game, you'll each get to play 2. These also follow the same rules. They cannot be within 2 of a shrine or a crystal source. So you're going to have to start setting these up. Now, note that these fit into spaces. I haven't explained the board layout exactly yet, but note that these occupy 1 full space. So these big bordered sections on the board here are spaces. So that might be an example of how you might lay out the board if you were doing it in the full gameplay mode. But now I'll just set up the recommended starting setup for your first game. And there you have it. That's the recommended starting setup with the 4 crystal sources like this, and the chapter shrine and the demon shrine. You could quite easily swap in any 2 factions here, just replacing the shrines as appropriate, and carry on with the suggested setup for the first game. The next thing we're going to do is put our armies on the board. And deployment works very interestingly. We'll start off with the positioning player who will place down 1 unit being 1 squad card's worth of models. So you might put down just your Angel of Death or all 4 pilgrims. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about these spaces on the board, just so that you understand how you can position within them. As you can see here, the board is made up of these thick bordered spaces with little hexagons in them. Some models require an entire space to live in, while other models just occupy a single hex. However, all models move by spaces. So this man here can move 1 into this space here, and when he lives in that space, he can be placed in any hexagon within that space. So that gives him a lot of movement. He's quite fast and nimble and can move around like that. This Angel of Death is much larger and requires much more space, probably due to her incredible wingspan. She needs to move and occupy entire spaces. If a larger model, that is a model with a larger base, ever wants to move into a space with a smaller model, they'll push that model out of the space. But more on how pushing works later when we discuss movement in the actual gameplay section of this video. During the game, models will be able to move freely around the board. They're not bound to their squadron. They do not have to stay in the same space as their squadron. They can go and live wherever they want. During deployment, they must be deployed touching their base. During the actual game, you can never straddle 2 spaces with your single base. You either exist in one space or the other space and are placed within them. During setup, you also cannot do this. However, squads of single men, like the pilgrims here, can exist in 2 spaces, provided they are maintaining their base-to-base contact rule. So I can deploy in any sort of spaces I want, but I have to deploy touching base-to-base. I cannot deploy in base-to-base contact with any of these tiles. What this means is our friendly Holy Knight here can deploy in spaces adjacent to crystal sources. However, he cannot deploy with his base touching the crystal source. And you're not in base-to-base contact with an enemy. But if I were to pick up my unit of 4 pilgrims here, I can put them anywhere on the board that I want, provided I obey these rules. So this is not my side, and that's not my enemy's side. I could deploy my pilgrims over here if I wanted. Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe it's a bad idea. These are the kind of heavy strategic decisions you're going to have to make when you're playing the Edge Dawnfall. And once you've placed a unit, your opponent then has an opportunity to place a unit as well. During deployment, we cannot place base to base with our enemies. However, we could actually deploy in the same space. So if the demon player decides that the Master of Elements should be deployed here, the chapter player can decide to put their Holy Knight here. They are in the same space, but they're not base to base. This means they can't attack each other in close combat, but they can give each other a pretty good running go at it once the game gets started. So I've just deployed these out with pretty reckless abandon, but this game is really all about controlling these crystal sources. So you'll learn over the course of this video why these crystal sources are so important, but during this setup section of the setup, you will want to think really hard about where these crystal sources are and how you're going to control them and prevent your enemy from controlling them. The next section of the setup is place victory tokens and faction markers. If you're playing in a 3 or 4 player game or the team game, you don't need to worry about this because you'll do things with victory points differently. Instead, you remember those 10 tokens that we left in the bag because we're not going to be using them? You just gather those and keep them close at hand. Those are your victory point tokens. You start with 10 and you're going to give them away to people as they murder you. In a 2-player game, it works slightly differently. In a 2-player game, we're essentially playing a victory point tug of war. So what we're going to do is set up that track now. So here we have the victory point tracker, and we're going to take our little victory point token, we're going to put it here in the middle. Then each player will put their faction token on their side. That is the side where they've put all their squad cards, etc. So there we've got the chapter, and here we've got the demons. Over the course of the game, as one side gains victory points, they'll move the tracker towards their side, and as the other side gains victory points, they'll move it back towards the middle. If at the end of the game it's in the middle, then it's a draw. Otherwise, whoever has it on their side is the winner. But it's a little more complicated than that. We'll get to that in the gameplay section after setup. Now everybody's going to prepare their starting crystals pool. This is where we take some crystals from the generic pool and put them into our pool. This is your active crystal pool. As you spend crystals over the course of the game, you'll be putting them into your depleted crystal pool. But don't worry, you start with active crystals. And you put crystals into your pool equal to the number of players. So in this 2-player versus game, we'll just have 2 crystals. But if it was a 3-player or 4-player free-for-all, we would get more. Note that there'd be a bigger overall pool as well. And remember, just like the charge tokens, these crystals are component limited. So if someone gets them all, then bully for you. That's really bad. The final thing is to draw your starting hand of cards. So that's 3 cards off the top of your action deck. And these 3 cards form your starting hand. The last thing that happens is that the positioning player now gets 1 free move. Note that this isn't a move of a model in the sense that a redeployment. This is a move as in an actual move action. Let's have a quick look at the move stats so we understand what this means. All of these creatures have stats on them. I'll go through the whole stat bar a bit later when I explain combat. But this stat at the bottom is movement, and this is the number of spaces they can move. Remember, spaces are these giant sections with a thick border, so 3 spaces is pretty dang fast. So in this case, we're probably looking to see how we can get the most possible crystal sources. Our chapters faction were the positioning player, which means they get the free move, so they're going to move their pilgrims over here, and they're going to try and capture as many crystal sources as possible, because that's a pretty good opening move. So they're going to go 1, 2 to move 1 here. 1, 2 moves this man over here. 1, 2 gets this guy in here. This guy goes 1, 2, running for that crystal over there. Unfortunately, exposing himself to the gorehound. Now, you'll note that they've scattered and split up. It's because this is a move action, and they don't have to obey the deployment rules. So that's a move action, and with that, the countering player begins the first turn. There are 3 ways in which the Edge Dawnfall can end. The Edge Dawnfall can end by completely destroying all of your opponent's models. Now, some models can come back from the dead, which is pretty cool. There's a faction called the Faceless, who are basically robot zombies. But it doesn't matter. If at one point all of your models are off the board, then you lose the game. Immediately. No matter how many victory points you have, if all your models are off the board, you lose. Even if you bring one back, you still lose. You know, you could lose all your models on the board, because your models can die on your turn. You could lose the game on your turn, bring them back from the dead on the same turn, you still would have lost, because at one point, all of your models are off the board. The other way the game can end is if this victory point marker here ever covers up someone's faction card like this. It is entirely possible, although very improbable, but entirely possible, that you could actually get the victory point marker onto your faction banner here, and then in the same turn lose so many victory points that your opponent actually wins the game. But at the end of that turn, the game will end no matter what, because a faction token was eclipsed by the victory point marker. The other way the game can end is if any of these action decks ever completely exhaust. If an action deck of cards completely exhausts, then The game will end at the end of the turn, and whoever has the most victory points is the winner. In a free-for-all game, it's slightly different because instead of having this tracker here, you've got these little pools of victory point tokens that you give away. So to lose that game, it's the same rule for models. If all your models are destroyed, you lose. If you run out of victory point tokens, you've given them all away to your opponents, you lose. If you ever get 4 victory points from all of the other opponents, you immediately win. For the team game, it's kind of the same thing. If you lose all your models, your team loses. Now, that's just one player. If one faction on your team loses all of its models, your whole team loses. If your opponent gets 8 victory points from your team, then they win. That can be any combination of the 2 factions. 8 total victory points from your side, they win. If any player's action deck is depleted, that marks the game end, although not necessarily a loss for that team. The game will end at the end of the turn in which the action deck was depleted, but whoever has the most victory points is declared the winner. So that's how you win and how the game ends. But let's have a look at now the 2 turn types. In the game, there are 2 types of turn, an active turn and a passive turn. On an active turn, you can activate one of your squads and move all of the models in that squad and attack with all of the models in that squad. You can only ever activate one squad per active turn. This is very important for 2 reasons. One, when you activate a squad, you can flip its squad card. That's very, very important. And I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But the other reason is that you can give them attachments, enhancements. You can play cards from your hand that allow them to move, that allow them to do combat, all that kind of good stuff. So you can get extra movement and combat out of your squads on your turn. You're not limited to just moving one squad and just combating with one squad. However, only the activated squad counts as activated. A squad can move, it's not activated. A squad can combat, it's not activated. If you played cards in order to do it, if you used abilities in order to do it. On your active turn, you can activate one squad. When you activate it, you can flip its card, and then you can move and attack with it in any order. On your active turn, you can play any number of cards from your hand and use their abilities. You can also flip your chapter banner. All of your chapter banners have abilities on them, and you can flip them over in order to use those abilities for benefits. A passive turn is the other kind of turn. When you're taking a passive turn, you can flip your active turn marker here. So this is the turn reference card here, and you can see here we've got the active turn with play cards. We've also got the activate a squad thing here. And finally, the end step, which has you drawing more cards to fill up your hand. You can also ditch a card during the end step if you don't like the card you have in hand. On the flip side, you've got the passive turn. Now, the first thing that happens on the passive turn is harvest. This is so important. It basically defines how the game is going to be played. I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. But that you get 1 crystal from each crystal source you control. Remember, these are your crystal sources here, and if you control them during your passive turn, you'll gain new crystals for your crystal pool. That's really important because crystals basically allow you to win the game. Charge enhancements. So you'll have some enhancements that you can play on your squads. Those are like upgrades, and they'll get charges on them. Remember those charge tokens we set out earlier? These guys, well, you can put more charges on your things that require charges to be used. You can also refresh crystals. When you spend crystals, they move to your depleted pool. During your passive turn, you can refresh them, and then they can be used again. Finally, you can flip your banner. So if you used your banner action and it's on its flipped side, you can flip it back over to its active side so you can use your ability again. Some units, like the Angel of Death, have different modes that have different sort of functions. For example, in her basic mode, she's quite a good all-round unit. She has 2 initiative, 2 combat, 2 defense with a free reroll, and 3 movement. That's pretty decent. On the flip side, she loses all of her defense, but what she gains is 6 movement and the ability to ignore terrain and models when she moves, because she's in flight mode. So you don't always want her in flight mode because she's very vulnerable without her defense, but it gives her incredible movement to swoop around the battlefield, causing shenanigans. You can only flip to one side when she's activated. There might be cards that allow you to flip this in your deck, depending on what kind of faction you are. Or, for the case of the chapter, they actually have a banner ability that allows them to change the mode of the squad outside of activation. That's unique to the chapter. Most factions don't have this option, and some factions play with this a little differently. However, the basic idea is that when you activate the unit, you flip the card if you want to. You don't have to. But you can only flip it once when the unit's activated, and then you carry out movement and combat with that unit. The Holy Knight is a different kind of unit in the sense that when you flip him, you can see down here he's got a 2 crystal cost on it. So you pay 2 crystals to flip this card, which means moving them from their active pile to the depleted pile. I've paid 2 crystals, I can now flip my Holy Knight, and he goes into what's called upgraded mode, where he is just better. All of his stats are just better. Now that he's upgraded, I never want him turned back around. So you remember that harvest thing? Harvesting crystals is so crucial to your success because crystals are good for everything. So these crystal sources can be controlled. And the way in which you control them is by getting into base-to-base contact with them. It's very simple to establish who controls a crystal source. Are they the only one with squads touching it? For example, here we can see that the chapter control 2 crystal sources. This is bad news because it means when they take the passive turn, they're going to harvest 2 crystals, which means they're going to take these 2 crystals and add them to their active crystal pool. Now they've got 4 and you've got 2, and that's bad news. Fortunately, contesting crystal sources is not that difficult. The minute you get one of your models in base-to-base contact with the crystal source, it is now contested. Nobody controls this crystal source, and during a passive turn, nobody's going to get any crystals. And it doesn't matter how many guys your opponent has touching that crystal. If you've got 1 guy on the crystal, it's contested. The game is essentially a game of threat and territory control. Really, it's all about controlling these crystals, and so you're thinking, well, my opponent probably wants to take a passive turn next turn, so I'm going to try and contest these crystals so that if he takes a passive turn, then he's not going to get those crystals, or I'm going to go and take control of my own crystal sources so that if he takes a passive turn, I can take a passive turn and level the playing field. That's the kind of thing you have to be thinking about, because if your opponent gets too ahead of you on crystals, then you're going to lose the game for sure. So we looked at the movement stat earlier and how characters move between spaces. Let's look at some of the more subtle elements of character movement. Remember, when you activate a unit, it can do just 2 things, move and combat, or combat and move. As you saw earlier with our pilgrims, when you activate a unit, all of the models in that unit can move and combat. So if that's your big boss man like the Son of Kyber here, it's just 1 dude who moves and 1 combat that happens. However, if you've got 4, then you can do 4, and that's cool. Here's a situation where our Angel of Death, who has 3 movement, wants to come over here to this side of the board. Unfortunately, she's got 2 spaces in front of her with characters blocking her movement. When a character with a bigger base ends their movement in a space with a character who has a smaller base, that character is pushed out. If there were multiple characters in there, they would all be pushed out. Then, the player who moved the piece takes those characters and places them in base-to-base contact with the character who pushed them out. This also applies to friendly units, and you can place them however you like. Unfortunately for our Angel of Death here, she wants to get over here, so she doesn't want to stop in this space, she wants to move right through it, but she can't. The same is true of our Gorehound. He also can't fit in that space, which means he can't move through it, and if he wants to get to the other side, he's going to have to go all the way around. Some characters do have a movement option that allows them to ignore models and terrain, in which case they can just move freely into any space they want, provided it's within their movement range, and they can ignore all of this stuff. However, if you're stuck in not flight mode and you want to move, then you've got to obey these rules. So in this case, our Angel of Death would actually have to go all the way around this man, which would only allow her to get over here and not into the space she wanted to. If you have a bigger base and you're moving into a space with a person with a smaller base, you can elect to push them if you want. For example, our Holy Knight here could easily slot into many different sides of this space, but he wants to push the Master of Elements away from that crystal, so he decides to go here, covering up the Master of Elements space, and that he chooses to place him base-to-base contact as far away from the crystal as possible. The Master of Elements cannot push the Holy Knight back because the Holy Knight's base is bigger. Remember, pushing only works if your base is bigger. So the Son of Kyber and the Angel of Death cannot push each other around. They can only lock in vicious giant model combat. I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but I think it's quite apparent. You cannot move through crystal sources and you cannot move through shrines. These are impassable terrain. That covers moving. Let's talk about combat. Combat is very simple, but there's a few interesting nuances that make it special. We saw the Angel of Death squad card earlier. Let's take another look. This blue stat at the top is called Initiative. This red stat here is called Attack, and the stat below it is called Defense. Note that this die symbol means that she gets a free reroll, or when she's rolling for defense. Combat actually works pretty simply. When combat is initiated, models must be in base-to-base contact. They cannot attack each other if they're not in base-to-base contact. So, provided they are, and someone has a combat to initiate, for example, the Angel of Death activated this turn, which means that she can initiate a combat, so she does so. She initiates the combat against the Son of Kyber. First thing we do is check our initiative values. These are equal, which means the attacker attacks first. Note that if the Son of Kyber had a higher initiative, then he would attack first. It doesn't matter who initiates the combat. Whoever has a higher initiative will always attack first, which can make life very difficult, as you'll see when I continue to explain the rules of combat. But remember, when drawn, the player who initiated the combat attacks first. Then, what you do is you roll a die. So our Angel of Death here has rolled a 2. She adds her attack value of 2, giving her a total of 4. Then, the Son of Kyber rolls for defense. So he's got a 0 and adds his defense of 1, which is lower than 4, which means that he loses and takes a wound. However, he's got this funky cog. What does this funky cog do? Well, when you roll the funky cog, you have two options. You can either re-roll your die, hoping for a better result, but the second result you'll have to live with. Or you can regenerate a gem. It's kind of like a comeuppance prize. So you can take a crystal from your depleted pool and put it back in your active pool. This is really potent, and this is always a difficult decision. Let's say he decides to regenerate a crystal so he doesn't re-roll. That means that he's going to take a wound. When you take a wound, you lose endurance equal to the number of wounds you took. So in this case, he's going to lose 1 of his 4 endurance. If you ever take a wound and you're completely out of endurance, you die. And the model is removed from the board. Note that if you're in combat with a model who is part of a squad, you can only kill that model. So if my Gorehound here does 3 wounds to this Pilgrim, I don't know how the Gorehound would do that, but maybe it's got an enhancement or something on it, or magic, whatever. But if he does 3 wounds to this Pilgrim, first I would take away any endurance the squad had, and then I would kill this model, and any excess wounds are lost. Note that this shared factor does not apply even if they're in base-to-base contact. So for example, if the Gorehound did 3 wounds to one of these Pilgrims, endurance would be lost, and then the Pilgrim that he attacked would be removed, but the other Pilgrim model would not be removed. Our Angel of Death was lucky to do a wound to the Son of Kyber, but let's pretend for a minute that the Son of Kyber successfully defended. Now, if you successfully defend, that is, the attacker fails to wound you, you get to do a counterattack, which means you get to hit them back. So if it's your turn and you want to attack someone with a higher initiative than you have to really hope you can defend their attacks. They're going to hit you first, but you'll get to attack back if they fail to hit. So our Angel of Death has just failed to wound the Son of Kyber. That means the Son of Kyber gets to attack her back. Now, if you remember in our early example, he rolled a cog and regenerated a crystal. That means he has a crystal to spend. And so the Son of Kyber decides to spend that crystal to upgrade his die from the yellow one to the red one. So that costs a crystal, which means the demon player has to move 1 crystal from their active pool to their depleted pool. The red die is much better than the yellow die. The yellow die has 2 zeros on it. It's got a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4. But 2 zeros. It's a bad die. The red die is actually a standard D6 with 1 through 6 on it, and 1 and 2 are in cogs. So it's a much better die in general. So he's going to roll for attack, and he gets a 7. Now, the Angel of Death can't actually defend that with this die. The maximum she can get is 6, which means that she's going to have to go up to a red die if she wants to successfully defend. However, she depleted all of her crystals earlier doing actions and playing cards and stuff, so she cannot upgrade to the red die. That doesn't mean it's pointless to roll this die, because she could get a cog, which would allow her to regenerate her die, a crystal for later. She's rolled a 4, which is not in a cog, and it only gives her a 6, so she hasn't defended. But she's got a free reroll thanks to her Angel of Deathness. So hopefully... Nope, still a 4. So she takes a wound, and the combat ends. Some units, like these Rangers, can shoot. Shooting doesn't work like a regular combat. In fact, a combat action, when you activate a squad and take a combat, only applies to hand-to-hand combat. The only way you can actually shoot your guns, or throw your axes, or let out your lightning bolts, is using action cards from your hand that allow you to do this. For example, this action card here. It says Ranger, and it says Shoot, so the Ranger will shoot. It costs 0 crystal to use the shoot, and it says, with all Rangers in the squad, at any one target model, range is unlimited and line of fire is required. Check targets for hit. If you're in aim mode, add 2 to the roll. The effect is 1 wound. Shoot may be used instead of a backstab or an attack roll. So, lot going on there. Ignore the last part. That aim mode, just remember that squads have their basic mode, and the Rangers' other mode is called aim, in which they have no defense, no initiative, they can't attack at all, but they're more likely to hit. So, check for hit. What does that mean? Well, don't worry, we'll talk about that later. First, let's look at this. Range unlimited, line of fire required. So, range must be drawn according to the line of sight. So, range must be counted in spaces. Note that this would be range 1, this is range 2, this is range 3. We can't go to range 4 because there's a crystal source blocking our line of sight. However, the Rangers have unlimited range because their guns are so powerful, or crossbows or whatever they are. The Master of Elements does not block line of sight. So they can shoot all the way to here. They could actually shoot all the way across the board here until they're blocked by this crystal source in the distance. But they have no targets in this direction, and over here they're just blocked by the board edge. They could also fire behind them because units don't have facing. But in this case, they want to shoot one of these Dark Scholars. They just hate the Dark Scholars. They cannot target the unit. They can only target a model. Some shooty men work differently to others. So the Rangers can each target 1 each, or they can both target 1. They've got to check for hit. Checking for hit is different to checking against defense. When you check for hit, you roll a die, and you can always upgrade to the red die if you spend the crystal. Whenever you go to roll, you can always upgrade to the red die, but it always costs a crystal. But when you want to check for hit, you roll a combat die, and then check your opponent's initiative. Initiative represents their sort of dodginess and quickness. That's why the quick ones with the higher initiative attack first in combat. In this case, it represents their ability to dodge bullets. So, in order to hit the Dark Scholars, the Rangers must exceed their initiative value. That's a 3. So our Rangers have hit, which means the effect comes into play, which is 1 wound. So the Dark Scholars suffer a wound. That means they'd remove an endurance if they had it. If they didn't have an endurance, they'd have to remove a model. And then you can go on and resolve the other Ranger, picking a target for that one to attack. The targets can be any model anywhere, provided it's in line of sight. So you could have one guy shoot a Dark Scholar, the other guy shoot the Master of Elements. But as we know from any skirmish combat game, it's always better to focus fire than split your fire. Note that there is no counterattack for ranged combat. It should also be noted that that card said backstab on it. Backstab is a keyword that just means this attack does not provoke a counterattack. So if you have the ability to do a backstab, then you can attack with impunity. But here's the thing. Nobody has a backstab on their squad card. Backstab only comes from enhancements. I've mentioned enhancements a bunch of times. What are they? They're a specific kind of action card. So with the exception of the Faceless, who have 4 kinds of action cards, everybody else has 3 kinds of action cards. Action cards come in basically immediate effects, they come in enhancements that can be equipped to units to upgrade them, and they come in sort of like lightning effects that are used to be played at specific times. So on your turn, you can play action cards at any time you want. But on your opponent's turn, you can't play any action cards at all unless you have the instant lightning effect, in which case you can use them on your opponent's turn. Note that during a passive turn, nobody can play any cards of any kind. Just can't do it. Nobody can play cards on a passive turn. So here we've got some examples of cards from the deck of the chapter. Let's look at this one first. So remember, this card has two effects on it, a top effect up here and a bottom effect down here. And the top effects typically are quite general things. This is pay 0 crystals to move with all models in one chapter squad. So that's great. You don't actually have to pay any resources to do this, which is great, and it lets you do a free move. Note, this doesn't count as an activation, it's just a move, so you cannot flip your squad card with this effect. But you can move all of your models, which is great because it means you can go and capture crystals and stuff like that. Now this card is also a Holy Knight card, which means this bottom ability can only be played for Holy Knights. And you pay a crystal to use it, so we've got to take a crystal from our active pool and put it in our depleted pool. And then it says here, a card text. Move and then push one enemy model base to base with this knight to any space adjacent to his original position. If you ever see this symbol anywhere, that just means base to base. So that doesn't mean in the same space necessarily, it just means that you've got to be touching base to base. This symbol would also count for that. That would be base to base there as well. Now over here we see another Holy Knight card, but we see this White Lightning. Now this White Lightning might be here, it might be down here, it could be on both sides, but this is the one that allows the card to be played at times other than during your turn. So this says, dodge. Use after a chapter model enters combat. Reposition this model to any adjacent space and cancel the combat. So you pay 2 crystals, but you can use this immediately when your opponent would go to attack you in order to evade it. So you can pay that dodge and get out of dodge. There's also another Holy Knight ability here, but that's just the same. Because there's no lightning, it can only be used on your turn. Finally, we've got here an attachment card. And the way we know attachment cards are these yellow banners along the top. It says, pay a crystal to attach and charge by 1 charge. So what that means is you pay a crystal, you put this down next to a unit, and it's now their sort of gear. You'll put one of those charge tokens we saw earlier on it to indicate it has 1 charge. Now, the charge allows us to use either ability, so we can spend these charges to use these abilities. The bottom ability can only be used by the pilgrims because it's tied to them, but some of these enhancement cards are generic on both sides, and so give the squad 2 abilities. And so this says last man standing. If there's only 1 pilgrim left, he gains +3 defense. But it's got this green token. What does that green token mean? What that means is that this is a passive ability. So once you get 3 charges on here, you don't actually have to pay 3 to use it. You pay 3 and put this green token on it. Now that means that this ability is in effect forever. And you can do this before you have 1 pilgrim left. And it just means that when you get down to the last pilgrim, you gain +3 defense. Awesome. But you must activate the passive ability first by spending the charges. Now this takes 3 charges and the enhancement only comes with 1. But if you remember, when you take a passive turn, then you gain charges on all of your stuff. So you'll have to take a couple of passive turns in order to generate enough charges to use this. And that means that you can't use this revenge ability, which says, use right after a model of this squad is killed in combat. It may perform a backstab before you remove it from the board map. 1 use per combat. So if you have multiple charges on here, you can do this multiple times, provided it's in different combats. You couldn't spend both charges when 1 model is killed, but you could spend both charges when if a second model is killed that same turn, and do 2 backstabs. Remember, we talked about backstab earlier. That's an attack that doesn't provoke a counterattack. So when you stick an enhancement on a unit, just put the enhancement with the squad card. You can only have 2 enhancements on any given squad, and you cannot have the same 2 enhancements on a squad. So they can have up to 2 different ones, but not 2 of the same. So we've covered all of that, and you're probably thinking, but Mike, how do I get victory points in order to win the game? That's a good question. And the answer is by killing models. So you win the game completely if you kill all your opponent's models. But if you take one of their models off the board, for every model you remove from the board, you gain victory points equal to that model's endurance. So for example, if you killed the son of Kyber and he was taken off the board, you would get 4 victory points, which would put you 2 away from winning. That's awesome. These are the victory point tokens for the demons, and in a game with 3 or 4 players, whenever you would give them victory points, or whenever they would take victory points, you give them these instead. Obviously, you have to give them yours if they killed your models, or if they've gained victory points against you. Some armies have much higher endurance than others, which means that you have to kill less of them in order to win the game. But, maybe they're harder to kill, or maybe they're killing your guys, and it's kind of balancing out. Some models also have 0 endurance, which means they're worth 0 points to kill. That can be really frustrating. But, you still have to kill them because they're probably causing you problems. But maybe you don't want to prioritize them. Tough strategic decisions. There are also cards that will allow you to gain victory points for certain things as well. For example, the Dvergr, who are steampunk dwarves who fight demons and are made of fire, have a card that allows them to gain victory points by attacking you and killing you. So they'll attack you, they'll kill you, they'll gain points for it, then they'll gain points for killing you as well. Finally, at the end of your active turn, you can ditch a card, you draw it back up to 3. There's nothing stopping you from taking multiple passive turns in a row. If you control tons of crystals and your opponent's not contesting them, just rack up on crystals. You can just spend those guys to just roll red dice against him or her. Or however they wish to be described. The point is that crystals are key. Controlling crystal sources are key. Always look at what your opponent's doing. Don't make stupid plays and throw models away to contest crystals. But here's the flip side. All of those action cards we looked at a moment ago cost crystals to play. But let's say you've got no crystals left and you really want to play a card that requires a clear crystal in a clutch move. You can. You can always substitute the payment of a crystal with an endurance. So you take an endurance away instead of paying a crystal. But that's a pretty big price because those are your hit points. And if you lose out on those, you're in trouble. If you don't want to lose an endurance, you can always lose a victory point instead. But you got to make sure that what you're paying for is like a really good thing, because giving away victory points is not a good idea generally. In a game with 3 or 4 players, you cannot give up victory points. You can only give up endurance in place of paying crystals. But that's what I mean. Like, you don't want to be giving up victory points or endurance, which is why crystals are so important to have. I think that just about sums up the gameplay for the Edge Dawnfall. So I did say at the end of this video I would cover deck building. That's true. There are a bunch of action cards in your deck. Like I said, in a 2-player game, you'll have 25 action cards. You'll have 15 in a 3 or 4-player game, but the game comes with about 80 for each faction. You can only include cards that correspond to squads in your army. But that's it. That's the only rule. Other than that, you have 25 or 15, and you can pick any cards you want. You can have 4 of a kind if there are 4 of a kind in the game. You can have 3 of a kind if there are 3 of a kind in the game. It really doesn't matter. It's totally up to you. You don't have to include any cards for a specific squad if you don't want to, but that's probably not a good idea. You might find that if you don't include any cards for a squad and your opponent ignores it, they're kind of left redundant and unable to do anything. Remember, if you are getting together with your friends to play a 4-player free-for-all, you will have to put together some decks beforehand. Take a look at the pre-constructed decks and take those as a guideline, a hint. You can probably get away with using most of those and just withdrawing some of the duplicates, things like that. Or maybe just take out one of the squads and take away all the cards for that squad. Remember, you don't have to use the leader of your faction, but you probably ought to because they're very powerful and have lots of cool special abilities. There's a lot of optional rules as well that you can add in. For example, if you want to make the game start off faster or a bit easier, then then every player starts with 3 crystals instead of 2. You can also make the game more forgiving by whenever someone takes a passive turn, everybody harvests crystals instead of just the player who took the passive turn. That's another variant. There are variants for basically everything. You can play a variant where you can buy victory points with crystals. So you spend 3 crystals, get a victory point. There's what's called scripted mode, which is where you pre-construct the order of your action deck. There's also something called strategic mode, where you draw 4 cards instead of 3, or 5 cards instead of 3 if you want to play even more strategically. There's also like focused game mode where you have 20 cards instead of 25 cards in your deck. They give you lots and lots of options for variants, but so far I've found that the basic rules are very comprehensive and feel very solid. So those are only there for you to experiment with if you feel the need to do so. There's another variant where you play the crystal sources before the shrines, which allows you to block your opponent's potential shrine placement places with crystal sources. Of course, this variant would favor teams that can move their shrines, like the Reborn and the Razek. So I did tell you guys I would give you a quick sort of rundown of the factions. I don't know them all as well as I would like, so I'm going to keep this very brief, but this should give you a bit of flavor. The chapter are like your sort of Space Marines of the Edge Dawnfall. By that I mean they're generic human do-gooders, religious fanatics as well, but they are an all-round faction, very good at buffing, and they've got some units that can get buffed up and become very tough. They've also got those pilgrims who are sort of like cheap meat shields, cannon fodder, who can run around and harvest crystals and are particularly good at that. So that's the chapter. When they're touching their shrine, they gain bonuses. You've also got the demons next. They are like sort of wizardy types, actually, more than anything. They've got some really tough units, but they are mostly about sort of shenanigans. They've got a lot of debuffs. They've got sort of spells that effects like freeze that freeze your opponents, and they can teleport around the board and stuff like that, so they can do all kinds of shenanigans. Their shrine counts as a crystal source. They also have ways of gaining like temporary crystals, so they've got all that kind of sort of tricksy stuff going on. You've got the Reborn, who are tree folk. The Reborn have some really tough units. They've also got some really weak units, but that aren't worth any victory points. So that's really interesting. Their basic unit are these tree maidens, actually called tree maids, who have no endurance, so they're not worth any points, which means they're quite vulnerable to being killed, but your opponent's not really incentivized, so they can kind of run around the board getting into trouble. You've also got these vines that grow out of your shrine, and that's like this sort of evil forest, and those vines can't be, they block movement, and if your opponent's touching them, they get wounded, and you can move through them like conduits around the board. So you have to make sure that you're placing those all the time as well. So that's really cool and interesting. You've got the Faceless faction, who are like robo-zombies. They're basically like what happens if a crystal touches a body and a set of knives at the same time. It becomes a zombie made of knives. And they're unique in the sense that their units all start off crap and get better, and it just kind of snowballs over the course of the game. So your opponent's kind of got a real sort of timer on there trying to kill you before you become just incredibly overpowered. A lot of their stuff involves killing their own men, but they can bring them back because they're zombies. And their shrine is a hatchery, and they can regain endurance by touching it. They also are the only unit that actually have squad cards in their action deck, which represent like further evolved forms. So you can always flip their cards for crystals in order to make the units better, like the Holy Knights get upgraded in chapter. But you can also then just pay crystals to put down these super forms of them, which are incredibly tough. So you really don't want that to happen. Then you've got the Razek, who are like sort of lightning ninjas from the future. They also have these sort of like little mecha dudes called Stream Guard, which are really cool. And they zip-zap around the board. They're kind of glass cannons. They're doing a lot of damage. They've got time-traveling mechanics. Their deck has a card that allows you to take 2 active turns in a row. Their shrine is a moving energy cloud that can just jump around the board and debuffs anyone who's touching it, if they're not Razak. Their banner recalls a card to their hand if they've just played it. So they're kind of like really fitting with this time travel theme. They've also got these steam surfers who are stream surfers who surf on lightning and are really fast and have 0 endurance. So they can just zip zap around the board contesting all the crystal sources. So you got to watch out for that. Wink. And then you've got the Dvergr, who are the dwarves, the sort of steampunk fire dwarves. And their whole sort of thing is defensive. They've got very low initiative, so they're almost always attacking last. But they can be powered up to become very defensive, which is very cool. Their shrine is a junkyard that you can place endurance on and then redistribute it to their squad. They've also got all these crazy enhancements, which are really cool and powerful, and their banner can just flip to move those around. They can also use their banner to attach to squad members, so they become one Uber squad guy. So that's pretty cool too. So it's super duper tanky and slow. Tanky and slow. Make sure you try to deploy your guys very close to crystal sources, or if you're deploying crystal sources, deploy them in the middle. And if you're Razek, deploy them far apart to take advantage of your stream surfers. But I think that pretty much covers it for the Edge Dawnfall. If I've missed anything, God, I hope not, but please leave a comment below asking any questions you might have. I will do my absolute utmost to answer them. Remember that all of your faction sheets have tactical information on them. You should read this before playing, absorb it, think about it, and also, let your opponent read yours so that, they've got some idea of what you might be trying to do or what you could do. And on the back are all of the cards with a little extra explanation about what they do and how any special rules you might find on cards that are available in your faction but not others. So you don't have to read all of this, but it's helpful to sort of familiarize yourself with this little red section at the bottom, and then you can reference this as you play cards if you don't fully understand them. But that's it for the basic skirmish mode of the Edge Dawnfall rules and setup. I will come back and do more. If you are interested, let me know. I'm very excited to play this. I'm going to be back tomorrow to play a matchup with Ollie Thomas. We'll probably come back and do sort of a few Edge Dawnfall specials because there's an awful lot of content to visit here and it's really fun. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Was I saying Plague Doctor that entire time when I meant Purge Doctor?